Let's talk about the Cuban sanctions. Now, this is kind of like a pretty hilarious topic. Like if you would listen to the left, they would say that, hey, what United States is doing as far as the sanctions on Cuba is wrong. It must end. And I agree. I think I think they completely need to unsanction Cuba and let free trade blossom. But the funny part actually is the left blaming Cuba's failures on the sanctions. Now, in this article, is trying to walk a tightrope here by Jacobin Mag. They are calling for the sanctions to be lifted and saying basically intimating that once the sanctions are going to be lifted, Cuba's socialist economy is going to boom. And a lot of the problems in Cuba is not the socialist government, which is awesome because it has a free healthcare and all sorts of freebies or whatever. The real issue is the American-Cuban sanctions. But if you do any modicum, tiny little bit of research, you just come to the conclusion that's pretty simple. It's just not an excuse whatsoever. Because while, yes, United States has sanctions, they can trade with anybody else in the world. They can trade with Latin America. They can trade with Europe. They can trade with China. If you can trade with China, like China already makes everything. So what does the United States make that like Cuba uh, really needs? Like what, like Pringles or something? Um, and the really hilarious part about it is if they unblock the sanctions, that means Cuba will buy things from other countries, which is capitalism. So I don't. How are they gonna? Well, the socialists. How are they gonna walk this logical tightrope of on one hand, capitalism is bad. Oh, like let's ask Bernie Sanders, or even Donald Trump for that matter. It's like, well, cheap crap from other countries are ruining the economy. We need to put tariffs. We need to block the cheap goods from other around the world because, oh, don't you know, in China they have very cheap labor and our workers can't compete with that. It's like, well, yeah, that's the whole point. So, build back better or America first. We got to block those goods, put high tariffs, and our industry inside America is going to blossom. Now, of course, that sounds really good. But unfortunately, things that sound in democracies, things that sound good to the average layman is actually horrible policy, economic policy, and things that sound awful, it's actually really good economic policy. So basically, socialists are advocating for capitalism, at least in as far as trade between countries, and then they're saying if this capitalism was to flourish in between countries, well, that's going to really make our prove that our socialism is blossoming. It's like no. Under your principles, Cuban industry should be booming right now. They can completely cut themselves off, or what is America always blame on? Like, oh, cheap crap from China. Well, Cuba can do that too. Completely cut off all imports, cheap imports from China, and just make your own cell phones, make your own tires, make your own steel. I mean, clearly, this is bad logic because you can look at it on the state level. Like everything, all the states inside of the United States trade with each other without any kind of tariffs or duties or anything. Now, if we were to start imposing trade restrictions on between states, like Ohio can't trade with anybody, California can't trade with anybody, would that make the states richer and boost their economy? Because all the money is not going to leave. All the money is going to circulate inside the state, make everybody poor, richer or whatever. Like no. And you could use this as a micro example too. Think of yourself as a mini entity, and you don't have to trade with Walmart. You don't have to trade with any store. You can grow your own food on your farm. You can sew your own clothes, and then you wouldn't say, "Oh, well, look at You know, you're living high on the hog. You're look at all the work you created for yourself. It's like, yeah, you could create a shit ton of work for yourself, but you're not gonna make shoes cheaper than Nike or Adidas or whatever. You're not gonna grow crops easier and cheaper than a big agricultural producer. So you're just making yourself poor. The same thing goes on the level of countries. Well, let's get into the article though. This year marks 60th anniversary of the beginning of the U.S. blockade of Cuba, collective punishment of the Cuban people for their independence from U.S. control. The blockade must end, and I agree. And I'm one of those people. I'm a capitalist, and I do not fear that, oh, it's going to make capitalism look really bad if you end the Cuban blockade. I mean, no. Because they have a shitty socialist government, a restrictive government in the first place. It's only obvious that, yes, once they end the blockade and they started dialing back the controls, let people, keep some of the money, let people open the businesses, well, yes, then the situation would improve a lot and the quality of life, standards of living will go up. But that's not like a rebuke of capitalism or anything. For 60 years, the U.S. empire was waged relentless economic war against the Republic of Cuba. This comes in the form of imposition of unilateral sanctions, which to date have cost the island, a nation, more than $130 billion. The U.S. sanctions or the blockade touch every part of Cuban life. They restrict access to medicine, food, building supplies, and crucially materials for vaccine development, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of weird. Like, why do they need to develop their own? Like, I mean, can you just buy the vaccine? The sanctions are also designed to smother Cuban economy by restricting travel and prohibiting business from trading with Cuba if they also wish to trade with America. What justification does the United States give for this inhumane blockade? So, blocking of trade between countries makes a country poor. Okay, we can establish that. I agree. But what about trade between people inside the actual country? Why can't people open stores, businesses, and trade amongst each other, aka free markets, aka capitalism? What's so bad with that? Why does the government have to manage all this quote-unquote trade? Why do you need this socialism? In the face of widespread Cuban support for Fidel Castro in the revolution in the 1950s, 1960s, the U.S. State Department admitted that only one to undermine the regime was to foster internal dissent by imposing economic hardship on the Cuban population. According to the now infamous internal memo written by Lester Mallory, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, he said the majority of Cubans support Castro. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. Well, that's what the United States is trying to impose on Russia currently, but that doesn't seem to. People don't really, just because they're they become poor, they don't throw off their government shackles. They don't rise up and overthrow the government. Today, the United States stands virtually alone in upholding the blockade. In 2001, for the 29th consecutive year, 184 United Nations members states voted in favor of a resolution demanding an end to the sanctions, with only the United States and Israel voting against. What? That's so funny. Israel. What does Israel have to do with anything? Even among imperialist nations, the global consensus is clear. It's illegal, immoral, and deadly. The U.S. blockade on Cuba must end. Doubling down. Rather than accept this fact, the recent administration have intensified sanctions. Following his ascension was through that President Joe Biden would follow the footsteps of Barack Obama, who had eased some restrictions imposed by the embargo and restored diplomatic relations with Cuba. Biden's first year in power, however, proved it would instead echo his predecessor, Donald Trump, whose administration was responsible for reversal of the Cuban thaw, imposing over 100 further sanctions and returning to 1996 Helms-Burton Act to reclassify the island as nation as state sponsor of terrorism and thereby dashing any hopes of U.S. detente. So Biden is, so they're calling the article goes on, talk about the little protest they had during COVID, but the socialist is unimpressed because it's apparently was astroturfed. I don't know about that. Maybe probably was. Such efforts were in vain. Responsible to the counter-revolutionary threat, Cuban Prime Minister Miguel Diaz-Canel addressed the country in town San Antonio Lides Banos and called upon the Cubans to reclaim the streets and defend the revolution. God, so stupid. What revolution? The revolution. It's like you've been living in poverty for like 60 years, 70 years. What are you revolting against? What do you have to lose here? Your free, non-existent healthcare? Cubans across the island answered this call, turning out in numbers that dwarf the anti-government rallies. Such was the support for the government that several Western media outlets, including Guardian, New York Times, and Fox News, and the Financial Times, used pictures of pro-government rallies to illustrate their coverage of anti-government protests, making it appear as if the large crowd supported the regime change in Cuba. For 60 years, then, the U.S. empire has tried to starve Cuba into submission, and for 60 years they have failed. So why does the blockade persist? Simply put, U.S. policymakers fear development potential of socialist Cuba unshackled from the crippling sanctions. In this address to the UN in 2004, former Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs Felipe Perez Roque described it best. The United States fears our example. It knows that if the blockade were lifted, Cuba economic and social development would be dizzying. It knows that. Why? Socialism. You have socialism. You could just make everything yourself. That's the whole point of socialism. The government should control everything and make its own. Why do you want to engage in capitalism with other countries? And you can already engage in capitalism with the whole world except the United States. So why don't you? Why don't you have dizzying development right now? I do admit, yeah, of course you would have even better development if the United States sanctions were to be lifted, and I do support that. I think it's ridiculous. Like, take away their last excuse, I mean, think about, like, Puerto Rico is a pretty poor place, and aside from the bullshit Jones Act or whatever, I mean, they could trade you can trade or import or export everything to the United States freely. But it's poor, other than the people that I just recently moved there, that that are they're the people that are trying to avoid taxes or whatever. But I mean, in Puerto Rico, it's like 25% of people, like young people, don't work because of the welfare or something. If it knows that we would be demonstrate even more than now possibilities of Cuban socialism, all the potential not yet fully deployed of a country without discrimination of any kind, with social justice, human rights for all citizens, not just for the few. Well, that's the problem with government. They're stuck in their bureaucracy, and by lifting sanctions on Cuba, you'd be seen as weak internationally. So maybe Florida is a battleground state, is a state that can flip either way and then cost you your presidency or whatever. So that's why government and socialism suck. They just can't change their mind. I mean, once entrenched political interests are fixed, you're screwed. And this just shows why socialism sucks, because the country can't, after 60 years, country can't change its mind about the sanctions. Critics of the Cuban government claim that it relies on easy excuse of the embargo to make up for misgovernance and then inevitable failure of socialism. If that's the case, why not lift the embargo and see for yourselves? Yes, they should. The United States is well aware that achievements of the Cuban Revolution and cannot accept the ramifications of a Cuba thriving while remaining independent of its own neocolonialism. Yeah, Cuba is like going to be a socialist Singapore. Like all nations, Cuba suffers from a host of problems that anger and frustrate citizens. Not all of these can be blamed on the embargo. Yeah, you don't say. From bureaucracy limiting challenges to power to governmental corruption. Yeah, aka socialism. It's less than ideal state of affairs. The pandemic wreaked havoc on the tourism industry, too, a crucial source for income for Cuba, which has compounded the crisis in which the nation finds itself. So you're missing the capitalistic activity caused by tourism. Cuba may have seen off counter-revolution, but the blockade persists and the U.S. subversion continues as long as Cuba development is stifled by the U.S. empire. It's ordinary Cubans who will suffer the consequences. There's only one way to alleviate the suffering of Cuba in the long term, and demand is universal. U.S. blockade must end, but the real issue is Cuba's socialist system must end. Because then if you have any kind of semblance of a free market, I mean, fuck the United States. It could trade with anybody in the world and become rich.